Welcome back to our read-aloud of A Separate Piece by John Knowles. Today we'll be reading chapters 9 and 10, which continue off of chapter 8, where Finney returned to Devon. And, of course, this is continuing off of Finney, who apparently subscribes to the conspiracy theory that the war is fake, and really it's just a bunch of fat dudes thinking it up. Fat old dudes thinking it up. Chapter 9. This was my first, but not my last, lapse into Finney's vision of peace. For hours, and sometimes for days, I fell, without realizing it, into the private explanation of the world. Not that I ever believed the whole production of World War II was a trick of the eye manipulated by a bunch of calculating fat old men, appealing though this idea was. What deceived me was my own happiness, for peace is indivisible, and the surrounding world confusion found no reflection inside me, so I ceased to have any real sense of it. And this relates to Finney's view on love that he mentioned before. This was not shaken even by the enlistment of Leper Lepellier, in fact that made the war seem more unreal than ever. No real war could draw Leper voluntarily away from his snails and beaver dams. His enlistment seemed just another of Leper's vagaries, such as the times he slept on top of Mount Katahdin in Maine, where each morning the sun first strikes United States territory. On that morning, satisfying one of his urges to participate in nature, Leper Lepellier was the first thing the rising sun struck in the United States. Early in January, when we had all just returned from the Christmas holidays, a recruiter from the United States ski troops showed a film to the senior class in the Renaissance room. To Leper, it revealed what all of us were seeking, a recognizable and friendly face to the war. Skiers in white shrouds winged down virgin slopes, silent as angels, and then, realistically, herringboned up again, but herringboned in cheerful, sunburned bands, with clear eyes and white teeth and chests full of vigor-laden mountain air. It was the cleanest image of war I had ever seen. Even the Air Force, reputedly so high above the infantry's mud, was stained with axle grease by comparison. And the Navy was vulnerable to scurvy. Nothing tainted these white warriors of winter as they swooped down their spotless mountainsides, and this cool, clean response to war glided straight into Leper's Vermont heart. So this, a recognizable, friendly face to war. Probably, let me check my notes here. So, I guess this whole thing dealt with what seems familiar. So for Gideon over here, because his happiness deceived him, because it was familiar, while over here, the familiarity that was built by this propaganda piece drug Leper into the war. "How do you like that?" he whispered to me in a wondering voice during these scenes. "How do you like that?" "You know, I think these are pictures of Finnish ski troops," Phineas whispered on the other side, "and I want to know when they start shooting our allies the Bolsheviks, unless that war between them was a fake too, which I'm pretty sure it was." Yeah, the Finns technically fought on the Axis side, but the Allies sort of ignored that. After the movie ended and the lights came on to illuminate the murals of Tuscany and the painted classical galleries around us, Lepper still sat amazed in his folding chair. Excuse me. Ordinarily he talked little, and the number of words which came from him now indicated that this was a turning point in his life. Here. Finney keeps things in perspective. You know what? Now I see what racing skiing is all about. It's all right to miss seeing the trees in the countryside and all the other things when you've got to be in a hurry. And when you're in a war, you've got to be in a hurry, don't you? So I guess maybe racing skiers weren't ruining the sport after all. They were preparing it, if you see what I mean, for the future. Everything has to evolve or else it perishes. Finney and I had stood up, and Lepper looked earnestly from one to the other of us from his chair. So this is an Lepper. Take the housefly. If it hadn't developed all these split-second reflexes, it would have become extinct long ago. You mean it adapted itself to the fly swatter? Queried Phineas. That's right, and skiing had to learn to move just as fast or it would have been wiped out by this war. Yes, sir. You know what? I'm almost glad this war came along. It's like a test, isn't it? And only the things and the people who have been evolving the right way survived. Wow, that's very ultra-social Darwinist of you. You usually listen to Lepper's quiet talking with half a mind, but this theory of his brought me to close attention. How did it apply to me and Phineas? How, most of all, did it apply to Lepper? I'm going to enlist in these ski troops, he went on, so unemphatically that my mind went back to half listening. Threats to enlist that winter were always declaimed like Brinker's, with a grinding of back teeth and a flashing of eyes. I had already heard plenty of them, but only Lepper's was serious. A week later he was gone. He had been within a few weeks of his 18th birthday, and with it all chance of enlistment, of choosing a service rather than being drafted into one, would have disappeared. The ski movie had decided him. I always thought the war would come for me when it wanted me, he said when he came to say goodbye the last day. I never thought I'd be going to it. I'm really glad I saw that movie in time. You bet I am. Then, as the Devon School's first recruit to World War II, he went out my doorway with his white stocking cap bobbing behind. It probably would have been better for all of us if someone like Brinker had been the first to go. He could have been depended upon to take a loud, dramatic departure, so that the school would have reverberated for weeks afterwards with Brinker's last word, Brinker's military bearing, Brinker's sense of duty, and all of us, influenced by the vacuum of his absence, would have felt the touch of war as a daily fact. This talks about people's presence as a quality, not as a what's it. But the disappearing tale of Lepper's cat inspired none of this. For a few days the war was more unimaginable than ever. We didn't mention it, and we didn't mention Lepper, until at last Brinker found a workable point of view. One day, in the butt room, he read aloud a rumor in a newspaper about an attempt on Hitler's life. He lowered the paper, gazed in a visionary way in front of him, and then remarked, "That was Lepper, of course." This established our liaison with World War II. The Tunisian campaign became Lepper's liberation. The bombing of the Ruhr was greeted by Brinker with hurt surprise. He didn't tell us he'd left the ski troops. The torpedoing of the Scharnhorst added again. Lepper sprang up all over the world at the core of every Allied success. We talked about Lepper's stands at Stalingrad, Lepper on the Burma Road, Lepper's convoy to Archangel. It's Archangelsk or whatever the... Don't use the English name. Don't use the English name. We surmised that the crisis over the leadership of the Free French would be resolved by the appointment of neither de Gaulle nor Giraud, but Lepellier. We knew, better than the newspaper, that it was not the Big Three, but the Big Four who were running the war. Creating that personal connection. In the silences between jokes about lepers' glories, we wondered whether we ourselves would measure up to the humblest minimum standard of the army. I did not know everything there was to know about myself, and knew that I did not know it. I wondered in the silences between jokes about leper whether the still hidden parts of myself might contain the sad sack, the outcast, or the coward. We were all at our funniest about leper, and we all secretly hoped that leper the incompetent was as heroic as we said. Everyone contributed to this legend except Phineas. At the outset, with the attempt on Hitler's life, Finney had said, if someone gave Leper a loaded gun and put it at Hitler's temple, he'd miss. There was a general shout of outrage, and then we recommended the building of Leper's triumphal arch around Brinker's keystone. Phineas took no part in it, and since little else was talked about in the butt room, he soon stopped going there and stopped making going as well. How do you expect to be an athlete if you smoke like a forest fire? He drew me increasingly away from the butt room, away from Brinker and Chet and all other friends, into a world inhabited by just himself and me, where there was no war at all, just Phineas and me alone among all the people of the world, training for the Olympics of 1944. So here we wonder, is Finney jealous? There's an A. There we go. Now I remember how to spell it. We're just close-minded. Saturday afternoons are terrible in a boys' school, especially in the winter. There is no football game. It is not possible, as it is in the spring, to take bicycle trips into the surrounding country. Not even the most grinding student can feel required to lose himself in his books, since there is a Sunday ahead, long, lazy, quiet Sunday, to do any homework. And these Saturdays are worst in the late winter, when the snow has lost its novelty and its shine. One second. And the school seems to have been reduced only to a network of drains. During the brief thaw in the early afternoon, there is a dismal gurgling of dirty water seeping down pipes and along gutters, a gray seam shifting beneath the crust of snow, which cracks to show patches of frozen mud beneath. Shrubbery loses its bright snow headgear and stands bare and frail, too undernourished to hide the drains it was intended to hide. These are the days when, going into any building, you cross a mat of dirt and cinders laden by others before you, thinning and finally trailing off into corridors. The sky is an empty, hopeless gray, and gives the impression that this is its eternal shade. Winter's occupation seems to have conquered, overrun, and destroyed everything, so that now there is no longer any resistance movement left in nature. All the juices are dead, every sprig of vitality snapped, and now winter itself, an old, corrupt, tired conqueror, loosens its grip on the desolation, recedes a little, grows careless in its watch, sick of victory and enfeebled by the absence of challenge. It begins itself to withdraw from the ruined countryside. The drains alone are active, and on these Saturdays their noises sound a dull recessional to winter. Only Phineas failed to see what was so depressing. Just as there was no war in his philosophy, there was also no dreary weather. I guess we could call him. Ooh. We could call. This could be comparing challenges versus circumstances. And how Finney sort of just looks past. I don't think I'm saying that right. As I have said, all weathers delighted Phineas. You know what we'd better do next Saturday, he began in one of his voices, low-pitched and evenly melodic, one The low-pitched and evenly melodic one, which for some reason always reminded me of a Rolls-Royce moving along a highway. We'd better organize the winter carnival. We were sitting in our room on either side of the single large window framing a square of featureless gray sky. Phineas was resting his cast, which was a considerably smaller one now, on the desk, and thoughtfully pressing designs into it with a pocket knife. "What winter carnival?" I asked. "The winter carnival, the Devon winter carnival." "There isn't any Devon winter carnival, and never has been." "There is now. We'll have it in that park next to the Niguamsa. The main attraction will be sports, naturally, featuring a ski jump. A ski jump? That park's as flat as a pancake. And some slalom races. And I think a little track. But we've got to have some snow statues, too, and a little music and something to eat. Now, which committee do you want to head?" I gave him a wintry smile. "The Snow Statues Committee." So Finney here, instead of inventing like sports like last time, another inventive. This time, party. I gave him a wintry smile at the Snow Statues Committee. "I knew you would. You always were secretly arty, weren't you?" It's artsy, not party. "I'll organize the sports. Brinker can handle the music and food. And then we need somebody to kind of beautify the place. A few holly wreaths and things like that. Someone good with plants and shrubbery. I know, Leper." From looking at the star he was imprinting in his cast, I looked quickly up at his face. "Leper's gone." "Oh yeah, so he is. Leper would be gone. Well, somebody else then." And because it was Finney's idea, it happened as he said, although not as easily as some of his earlier inspirations. For our dormitory was less enthusiastic about almost everything with each succeeding week. Brinker, for example, had begun a long, decisive sequence of withdrawals from school activity ever since the morning I deserted his enlistment plan. Where was I? Enlistment plan. There we go. He had not resented my change of heart, and in fact had immediately undergone one himself. If he could not enlist, and for all his self-sufficiency Brinker could not do much without company, he could at least cease to be so multifariously civilian. So he resigned the presidency of the Golden Fleece Debating Society, stopped writing his school spirit column for the newspaper, dropped the chairmanship of the underprivileged local children's subcommittee of the Good Samaritan Confraternity, stilled his baritone in the chapel choir, and even if in his most impressive burst of irresponsibility, resigned from the student advisory committee to the headmaster's discretionary benevolent fund. His well-bred clothes had disappeared. These days he wore khaki pants supported by a garrison belt and boots which rattled when he walked. Brinker. Change of heart. "Who wants a winter carnival?" he asked in the disillusioned way he had lately developed when I brought it up. "What are we supposed to be celebrating?" "Winter, I guess." "Winter?" He gazed out the window at the vacant sky and seeping ground. "Frankly, I just don't see anything to celebrate, winter or spring or anything else." This is the first time Finney's gotten going on anything since he came back. "He has been kind of non-functional, hasn't he? He isn't brooding, is he?" "No, he wouldn't brood." "No, I don't suppose he would." "Well, if you think it's something Finney really wants, still, there's never been a winter carnival here. I think there's probably a rule against it." I see, in a tone which made Brinker raise his eyes and lock them with mine. In that plodder's glance, all his doubts vanished, for Brinker the lawgiver had turned rebel for the duration. So Brinker, at this point, I think is getting an attitude sort of like, what's the point? Because of the inevitability of the war. The Saturday was battleship gray. Throughout the morning, equipment for the winter carnival had been spirited out of the dormitory and down to the small, incomplete public park on the bank of the Naguamset River. Brinker supervised the transfer, rattling up and down the stairwell and giving orders. He made me think of a pirate captain disposing of the booty. Several jugs of very hard cider, which he had browbeaten away from some lower-classmen, were the most cautiously guarded treasure. They were buried in the snow near a clump of evergreens in the center of the park, and Brinker stationed his roommate, Brownie Perkins, to guard them with his life. He meant this literally, and Brownie knew it, so he trembled alone there in the middle of the park for hours, wondering what would happen if he had an attack of appendicitis, unnerved by the thoughts of a fainting spell, horrified by the realization that he might have to move his bowels, until at last we came. Then Brownie crept back into the dormitory, too exhausted to enjoy the carnival at all. On this day of high illegal competitiveness, no one noticed. The buried cider was half-consciously plotted at the hub of the carnival. Around it sprang up large, sloppy statues, easily modeled because of the snow's dampness. Nearby, entirely out of place in the snowscape, like a dowager in a saloon, there was a heavy circular classroom table, carried there by superhuman exertions the night before on Finney's insistence that he had to have something to display the prizes on. On it rested the prizes: Finney's icebox, hidden all these months in the dormitory basement, a Webster's Collegiate Dictionary with all the most stimulating words marked, a set of York Barbles, the Iliad with the English translation of each sentence written above it, Brinker's file of Betty Grable photographs, a lock of hair cut under duress from the head of Hazel Brewster, the professional town belle, a hand-woven rope ladder with a proviso that it should be awarded to someone occupying a room on the third floor or higher, a forged draft registration card, and $4.13 from the headmaster's discretionary benevolent fund. Brinker placed this last prize on the table with such silent dignity that we all thought it was better not to ask any questions about it. Phineas sat behind the table in a heavily carved black walnut chair, the arms ending in two lions' heads, and the legs ending in paws gripping wheels now sunk in the snow. He had made the purchase this morning. Phineas bought things only on impulse and only when he had the money, and since the two states rarely coincided, his purchases were few and strange. Well, at least only when he has the money. That's very, very smart of him, not blasting his credit card. Chet Douglas stood next to him holding his trumpet. Finney had regretfully given up the plan of inviting the school band to supply music. Finney spending habits. Since it would have spread news of our carnival to every corner of the campus, Chet, in any case, was an improvement over that cacophony. He was a slim, fair-skinned boy with a ball of curly auburn hair curving over his forehead, and he devoted himself to playing two things: tennis and the trumpet. He did both with such easy inborn skill that after observing him I had begun to think that I could master either one any weekend I tried. Much like the rest of us on the surface, he had an underlying obliging and considerate strain which barred him from being a really important member of the class. You had to be rude at least sometimes, and edgy often, to be credited with personality, and without that accolade no one at Devon could be anyone, no one, with the exception, of course, of Phineas. Rude, please. Social structure. And Phineas sort of just ignores that social structure, which is actually a pretty good thing to do. To the left of the prize table, Brinker straddled his cache of cider. Behind him was the clump of evergreens, and behind them there was, after all, a gentle rise, where the ski jump committee was pounding snow into a little take-off ramp whose lip was perhaps a foot higher than the slope of the rise. From there, our line of snow statues, unrecognizable artistic attacks on the headmaster, Mr. Ludsbury, Mr. Patch Withers, Dr. Stanpole, the new dietitian, and Hazel Brewster, curved in an enclosing half-circle to the icy, muddy, lisping edge of the Tidewater Naguamset, and back to the other side of the prize table. When the ski jump was ready, there was a certain amount of milling around, 20 boys tightly reined in all winter. Stood now with a bit, as though with a bit firmly clamped between their teeth, ready to stampede. Phineas could have started the sports events, but he was absorbed in cataloging the prizes. All eyes swung next upon Brinker. He had been holding a pose above his cider of Gibraltar invulnerability. He continued to gaze challengingly around him until he began to realize that wherever he looked, calculating eyes looked back. Wow. All right, he said roughly. Let's get started. The ragged circle around him moved perceptibly closer. Let's get going, he yelled. Come on, Finney. What's first? Finney had one of those minds which could record what is happening in the background and do nothing about it because something else was preoccupying him. He seemed to sink deeper into his list. Phineas, Brinker pronounced his names with a maximum use of the teeth. What is next? Still, the sleek brown head mesmerized over the list. What's the big hurry, Brinker? Someone from the tightening circle asked with dangerous gentleness. What's the big rush? We can't stand here all day, he blurted. We've got to get started if we're going to have this. What's next? Phineas. At last the recording in Finney's mind reached its climax. Here, Brinker. Fresh. Finney to start. And we noticed that actually Finney, I was about to say like maybe Phineas is popping up more now, but I'm actually not sure about that. At last the recording in Finney's mind reached its climax. He looked vaguely up, studied the straggling at-bay figure of Brinker at the core of the poised perimeter of boys, hesitated, blinked, and his organ voice said good-naturedly, Next, well that's pretty clear, you are. Chet released from his trumpet the opening, lifting, barbaric call of a bullfight, and the circle of boys broke wildly over Brinker. He flailed back against the evergreens, and the jugs appeared to spring out of the snow. He kept yelling expletives, off balance among the branches. Branches. I don't know why I said branches. By then his cider, which he had apparently expected to dole out according to his own governing whim, was disappearing. There was going to be no government, even by whim, even by Brinker's whim, on this Saturday at Devon. From a scramble of contenders, I got one of the jugs, elbowed off a counterattack, opened it, sampled it, choked, and then went through my original plan by stopping Brinker's mouth with it. His eyes bulged, and blood vessels in his throat began to pulsate until at last I lowered the jug. He gave me a long, pondering look, his face closed and concentrating, while behind it his mind plainly teetered between fury and hilarity. I think if I had batted an eye, he would have hit me. The carnival was breaking apart into a riot hung like a bomb between us. I kept on looking expressionlessly back at him until beneath a blackening scowl his mouth opened enough to fire out the words, "I've been violated." I jerked the jug to my mouth and took a huge gulp of cider in relief, and the violence latent in the crowd drifted away. Perhaps the Naguamset carried it out on the receding tide. Brinker strode through the swirl of boys to Phineas. "I formally declare," he bellowed, "that these games are open." "You can't do that," Finney said rebukingly. "Who ever heard of opening the games without the sacred fire from Olympus?" So here we see the violence latent in the school drifted away. Sensing that I must act as the chorus, I registered on my face the universally unheard-of quality of the games without fire. "Fire, fire," I said across the damp snow. "We'll sacrifice one of the prizes," said Phineas, seizing the Iliad. "No, dude, don't burn the book." He sprinkled the pages with Smiter to make them a little more inflammable, touched a match to them, and a little jet of flame curled upward. The games, alight with Homer and cider, were open. Chet Douglas, leaning against the side of the prize table, continued to blow musical figures for his own enlightenment. Forgetful of us and the athletic programming Finney put into motion, he strolled here and there, sometimes at the start of the ski jump competition, blowing an appropriate call, more often invoking the serene order of Ivan? I forget how to pronounce his name. Or a high, remote, arrogant Spanish world, with the cheerful, low-down carelessness of New Orleans. The hard cider was beginning to take charge of us, or I wonder now whether it wasn't cider but our own exuberance with which intoxicated us, sent restraint flying, causing Brinker to throw the football block on the statue of the headmaster, giving me, as I put on the skis and slid down the small slope off the miniature ski jump, a sensation of soaring flight, of hurtling high and far through space, inspiring Phineas during one of Chet's Spanish inventions, climb onto the prize table, and with only one leg to create a droll dance among the prizes, spinning and spinning from one bare space to another, cleanly missing Hazel Brewster's hair, never marring by a misstep the pictures of Betty Grable. So, alcohol versus groupthink. Or primal groupthink, one could put it. Under the influence not, I know, of the hardest cider, but of his own inner joy at life for a moment, as it should be, as it was meant to be in his nature, Phineas recaptured that magic gift for existing primarily in space, one foot conceding briefly to gravity its rights, for spinning him off again into the air. It was his wildest demonstration of himself in the kind of world he loved. It was his choreography of peace. And when he stopped and sat down among the prizes and said, "Now we're going to have the decathlon. Quiet, everybody. Our Olympic candidate, Jean Forrester, is now going to qualify." It wasn't cider which made me, in this moment, champion of everything he ordered, to run as though I were the abstraction of speed, to block the half-circles of statues on my hands, to balance on my head on top of the icebox, on top of the prize table, to jump if he had asked it across the Naguamset and land crashing in the middle of Quackenbush's boathouse, to accept at the end of it amid a clatter of applause, for on this day even the schoolboy egotism of Devon was conjured what, a wreath made from the evergreen trees which Phineas placed on my head. It wasn't the cider which made me surpass myself. It was this liberation we had torn from the grey encroachments of 1943, the escape we had concocted, this afternoon of momentary, illusory, special, and separate peace. Separate. Wow. Invoking the title, huh? And it was this which caused me not to notice Brownie Perkins rejoin us from the dormitory, and not to hear what he was saying until Finney cried hilariously, "A telegram for Jean! It's the Olympic Committee! They want you! Of course they want you! Give it to me, Brownie! I'll read it aloud to this assembled host." And it was this which drained away as I watched Finney's face pass through all the graduations from between uproariousness and shock. I took the telegram from Phineas, facing in advance whatever the destruction was. That was what I learned to do that winter. I have escaped and need help. I am at Christmas location. You understand. No need to risk address here. My safety depends on you coming at once. Signed, your best friend, Elwyn Leper Lepellier. No, that's Vinny. Chapter 10. That night I made for the first time the kind of journey which later became the monotonous routine of my life, traveling through an unknown countryside from one unknown settlement to another. The next year this became the dominant activity, or rather passivity, of my army career. Not fighting, not marching, but this kind of nighttime ricochet, for as it turned out I never got to the war. Or foretelling, I guess, not shadowing. I went into uniform at the time when our enemies began to recede so fast that there had to be a hurried telescoping of military training plans. A program scheduled to culminate in 2 years became outmoded in 6 months. Crowds of men gathered for them in one place were dispersed to 20 others. A new weapon appeared, and those of us who had traveled to 3 or 4 bases mastering the old one were sent on to a 5th, 6th, and 7th to master the new. The closer victory came, the faster we were shuttled around America in pursuit of a role to play in a drama which, suddenly underpopulated from the first, now had too many actors, or so it seemed. In reality, there would have been, as always, too few, except that the last act, a mass assault against suicidally defended Japan, never took place. So, finally, we get a link to actual history and the end of the war. I and my year, not my generation, for destiny now cut too finely for that old phrase, I and those of my year were preeminently eligible for that. Most of us, so it was estimated, would be killed, but the men a little bit older closed in on the enemy faster than predicted, and then there was the final holocaust of the bomb. It seemed to have saved our lives. So journeys throughout unknown, so different stance on the atom. So journeys through unknown parts of America became my chief war memory, and I think of the first of them as this nighttime trip to Lepers. There was no question of where to find him. I'm at Christmas location meant that he was at home. He lived far up in Vermont, where at this season of the year even the paved main highways are bumpy and buckling from the freezing weather, and each house executes a lonely holding action against the cold. The natural state of things is coldness, and houses are fragile havens, holdouts in a death landscape, unforgettably comfortable, simple though they are, just because of their warmth. Lepers was one of those hearths perched by itself on a frozen hillside. I reached it in the early morning after this night which presaged my war. A bleak, draughty train... draughty? I'm gonna circle that. Let's see what that means. Ah. Oh no, it is drafty. It's just different. Okay. A damp depot seemingly near no town whatever, a bus station in which none of the people were fully awake, or seemed clean, or looked as though they had homes anywhere. A bus which passengers entered and left at desolate stopping places in the blackness. A chilled night-time wandering in which I tried to decipher between lapses into stale sleep the meaning of Leper's telegram. I reached the town at dawn, and encouraged by the returning light and coffee in a thick white cup, I accepted a hopeful interpretation. Leper had escaped. He didn't escape from the army, so he must have escaped from something else. Do I? Right. The most logical thing a soldier escapes from is danger, death, the enemy. Since Leper hadn't been overseas, the enemy must have been in this country, and the only enemies in this country would be spies. Leper had escaped from spies. I seized this conclusion and didn't try to go beyond it. I suppose all our butt-room stories about him intriguing around the world had made me half ready to half believe something like this. I felt a measureless relief when it occurred to me there was some color, some hope, some life in this war after all. The first friend of mine who ever went into it tangled almost immediately with spies. I had to hope that after all this wasn't going to be such a bad war. So I guess he sees what? Interest entails versus boring. Does good be bad in a war? The Leper house, the Lepellier house was not far out of town, I was told. There was no taxi, I was also told, and there was no one, I did not need to be told, who would offer to drive me out there. This was Vermont. But if that meant austerity towards strangers, it also meant mornings of glory such as this one, in which the snow, white almost to blueness, lay like a soft comforter over the hills, and birches and pines indestructibly held their ground, rigid lines against the snow and sky, very thin and very strong, like Vermonters. The sun was the blessing of the morning, the one celebrating element, an aesthete with no purpose except to shed radiance. Aesthete, a person who has or affects to have a special appreciation of art and beauty. I don't think that's it. Oh, personification. Radiance. A person who has or affects to have special appreciation of art or beauty. Everything else was sharp and hard, but this Grecian sun evokes joy from every angularity and blurred with brightness the stiff face of countryside. As I walked briskly out the road, the wind knifed at my face, for the sun caressed the back of my neck. The road led out along the side of a ridge, and after a mile or so I saw the house that must be Lepers, riding the top of the slope. It was another brittle-looking Vermont house, white, of course, with long and narrow windows like New England faces. Behind one of them hung a gold star, which announced that a son of the house was serving this country, and behind another stood Leper. While I was walking straight toward his front door, he beckoned me on several times, and he never took his eyes from me, as though it was they which held me to my course. He was still at this ground floor window when I reached the door, and so I opened it myself and stepped into the hallway. Leper had come into the entrance of the room on the right, the dining room. "Come in here," he said. "I spend most of my time in here." As usual, there were no preliminaries. "What do you do that for, Leper? It's not very comfortable, is it?" "Well, it's a useful room." "Yeah, I guess it's useful, all right." You aren't lost for something to do in dining rooms. It's the living rooms where people can't figure out what to do with themselves. People get problems in living rooms. Bedrooms, too. It was a try toward relieving the foreboding in his manner. It only worked to deepen it. He turned away, and I followed him into an unfurnished dining room of high-backed chairs, rugless floors, and cooled fireplace. "If you want to be in a really functional room," I began in false heartiness, "you ought to spend your time in the bathroom, then." Wow. Making the bathroom jokes. Really, man. He looked at me, and I noticed the left side of his upper lip once or twice as I thought he was about to snarl or cry. Then I realized this had nothing to do with his mood, that it was involuntary. He sat down at the head of the table in the only chair with arms, his father's chair, I supposed. I took off my coat and sat at a place in the middle of the table with my back to the fireplace. There, at least, I could look at the sun rejoicing on the snow. In here you never wonder what's going to happen. You know the meals will come in 3 times a day, for instance. So Leper, you see here, likes predictability. "I bet your mother isn't too pleased when she's trying to get one ready." Force sprang into his expression for the first time. "What's she got to be pleased about?" He glared challengingly into my startled face. "I'm pleasing myself," he cried fervently, and I saw tears trembling in his eyes. "Well, she's probably pleased." Any words would serve, the more irrelevant and superficial the better. Any words which would stop him. I didn't want to see this. "She's probably pleased to have you home again." His face resumed its dull expression. The responsibility for continuing the conversation, since I had forced it to be superficial, was mine. How long will you be here?" He shrugged, a look of disgust with my question crossing his face. The careful politeness he always had was gone. So war, change. or not war, but in this case the training. Well, if you're on furlough, you must know when you have to be back. I said this in what I thought at the time was my older voice, a little businesslike and experienced. The army doesn't give out passes and then say, come back when you've had enough here. I didn't get any pass, he groaned, with a sliding despair of his face and his clenched hands. That's what it was, a groan. I know you said, I spoke in short, expressionless syllables, that you escaped. I no longer wanted this to be true. I no longer wanted it to be connected with spies or desertion or anything out of the ordinary. Here we see desertion pop up for the first time. Here we strain on leper. I knew what it was going to be, and I no longer wanted it to be. I escaped, the word surging out in a voice and intensity that was not leper's. His face was furious, but his eyes denied the fury. Instead, they saw it before them. They were filled with terror. What do you mean you escaped? I said sharply. You don't escape from the army. That's what you say, but that's because you're talking through your hat. His eyes were furious now, too, glaring blindly at me. What do you know about it anyway? None of this could have been said by Leper of the Beaver Dam. Well, how am I supposed to answer that? I know what's normal in the army, that's all. Normal, he replied bitterly. What a stupid word that is. I suppose that's what you're thinking about, isn't it? That's what you would be thinking about, somebody like you. You're thinking I'm not normal, aren't you? I can see what you're thinking. I see a lot I never saw before. His voice fell to a querulous whisper. You're thinking I'm psycho. Very anxious. Here, Jean is judging what's normal. I gathered what the word meant. I hated the sound of it at once. It opened up a world I had not known existed. Mad or crazy or screw loose. Those were the familiar words. Psycho had a sudden mental word reality about it, a systematic, diagnostic sound. It was as though Leper had learned it while in captivity, far from Devon or Vermont or any experience we had in common, as though it were in Japanese. Fear seized my stomach like a cramp. I didn't care what I said to him now. It was myself I was worried about. For if Leper was psycho, it was the army which had done it to him, and I and all of us were on the brink of the army. You make me sick, you and your army words. So now Jean worries about its own prospects. They were going to give me, he was almost laughing, everywhere but in his eyes, which continued to oppose all. He said they were going to give me a discharge, a Section 8 discharge. As a last defense, I had always taken refuge in a scornful superiority based on nothing. I sank back in the chair, eyebrows up, shoulder shrugging. I don't even know what you're talking about. You don't just make any sense at all. It's Japanese. It's all Japanese to me. Section 8 discharge is for the nuts in the service. The psycho is the funny farm candidates. Now do you know what I'm talking about? They give you a Section 8 discharge, like a dishonorable discharge, only worse. You can't get a job after that. Everyone wants to see your discharge, and when they see a Section 8, they look at your face kind of funny. Discharge. Like you were looking at someone with their nose blown off but don't want them to know that you're disgusted. They look at you that way and then they say, well, there doesn't seem to be an opening here at present. You're screwed for life. That's what a Section 8 discharge means. Let's actually see that. Section 8 discharge. Here we go. Wikipedia. Section 8 was a category of discharge from the United States military used for a service member judged mentally unfit for service. Section 8 was also often given to cross-dressers, gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people. The term comes from Section 8 of the World War II era United States Army Regulation 615-360, concerning the separation of enlisted men from military service. Section 8 provided for the discharge of men who were deemed mentally unfit for military service. The term Section 8 eventually came to mean any service member given such a discharge or behaving as if deserving such a discharge, as in the expression, he's a Section 8. Section 8 discharges were often given to gay men, lesbians, bisexuals, cross-dressers, and transgender people, as they were deemed mentally unfit to serve in the military. A Section 8 discharge often made it difficult for people to find work in civilian life and did not allow veterans benefits. Oh, so that's true for him. Discharge under Section 8 is no longer practiced, as medical discharges for psychological or psychiatric reasons are now covered by a number of regulations. In the Army, such discharges are handled under the provisions of AR 635-200. Active Duty Enlisted Administrative Separations, Chapter 5, Paragraph 13 governs the separation of personnel medically diagnosed with a personality disorder. Interesting. You don't have to yell at me. There's nothing wrong with my hearing. Then that's tough for you, Buster. Then they've got you. Nobody's got me. Oh, they've got you all right. Don't tell me who's got me and who hasn't got me. Who do you think you're talking to? Stick to your snails, Lepellier. He began to laugh again. You always were a lord of the manor, weren't you? A swell guy, except when the chips were down. You always were a savage underneath. I always knew that, only I never admitted it. But in the last few weeks, despair broke into his face again. I admitted a hell of a lot to myself. Not about you. Don't flatter yourself. I wasn't thinking about you. Why should I think about you? Did you ever think about me? I thought about myself, Ma, and the old man, and pleasing them all the time. Well, never mind about that now. It's you he happened to be talking about now. Like a savage underneath. Now there was the blind confusion in his eyes again, a wild slyness under his mouth. Like that time he knocked Finney out of the tree. Here, Leper accuses Jean of crippling Finney. Whoops. I sprang out of the chair. Still laughing, Leper spoke, like that time you crippled him for life. I shoved my foot against the rung of his chair and kicked. Leper went over in his chair and collapsed against the floor. Laughing and crying, he lay with his head on the floor and his knees up. Always were a savage underneath. Quick heels coming down the stairs, and his mother, large, soft, and gentle-looking, quivered at the entrance. What on earth happened? Elwyn, I'm terribly sorry. It was a mistake. I listened objectively to my own voice. He said something crazy. I forgot. Myself. I forgot that there's something the matter with his nerves, isn't there? He didn't know what he was saying. Well, good heavens, the boy is ill. We both moved swiftly to help up the chuckling leper. Did you come here to abuse him? I'm terribly sorry, I muttered. I'd better get going. Mrs. Lepellier was helping Leper toward the stairs. Don't go, he said between chuckles. Stay for lunch. You can count on it. Always 3 meals a day, war or peace, in this room. And I did say, stay. Sometimes you are too ashamed to leave. That was true now. And sometimes you need too much to know the facts, so humbly and stupidly you stay. That was true now, too. It was an abundant Vermont lunch, more like a dinner, and first it had no more reality than a meal in the theater. Leper ate almost nothing, but my own appetite deepened my disgrace. I ate everything within reach, and then had to face aflame with embarrassment for more to be passed to me. But that led to this hard-to-believe transformation. Miss Lepellier began to be reconciled to me because I liked her cooking. Toward the end of the meal, she became able to speak to me directly in her high but gentle and modulated voice. I was so clumsy and fumbling and embarrassed that my behavior throughout lunch amounted to one long and elaborate apology, which, when she offered me a second dessert, I saw she had accepted. Well, he's a good boy underneath, she must have thought. A terrible temper, no self-control, but sorry, and he is a good boy underneath. Leper was closer to the truth. So Jean ingratiates. Leper's mom. I don't know why I didn't need it. Here we go. She suggested he and I take a walk after lunch. Leper now seemed all obedience, and except for the fact that he never looked at his mother, the ideal son. So he put on some odds and ends of clothing, some canvas and woolen and flannel, and pulled on to form a patchwork against the cutting wind, and we trailed out the back door into the splendor of the failing sunshine. I did not have New England in my bones. I was a guest in this country, even though by now a familiar one, and I could never see a totally extinguished winter field without thinking it unnatural. I would tramp along, trying to decide whether corn had grown there in the summer, or whether it had been a pasture, or what it could ever have been, in the sense, in that deep layer of the mind we're always judged by the five senses and primitive expectations. I knew that nothing would ever grow there again. We roamed across one of these wastes, our feet breaking through at each step the thin surface crust of ice into a layer of soft snow underneath, and I waited for Leper, in this wintry outdoors he loved, to come to himself again. Just as I knew the field could never grow again, I knew that Leper could not be a wild or bitter psycho trampling across the hills of Vermont. So here it's sort of a contrast between scars that don't heal with the field, or the healing of situation. Is there an army camp in Vermont? I asked, so sure in my illusion that I risked even making him talk about the army. I don't think there is. There ought to be. That's where they should have sent you. Then you wouldn't have gotten nervous. Yeah, a half-chuckle. I was what they call nervous in the service. Exaggerated laughter for me. Is that what they call it? Leper didn't bother to make a rejoinder. Before there had always been the polite capping of remarks like this. Yes, they do. That's what they call it. But today he glanced speculatively at me and said nothing. We walked on, the crust crackling uneasily under us. Nervous in the service. That sounds like one of Brinker's poems. You wouldn't know Brinker these days, the way he's changed. Leper says, I'd know him if he changed into Snow White. Well, he hasn't changed into Snow White. That's too bad. The strained laughter was back in his voice. Snow White with Brinker's face on her. There's a picture. Then he broke into sobs. Leper, what's the matter? What's it? What's the matter? Leper, Leper. Hoarse, cracking sobs broke from him. Another ounce of grief, and he would have begun tearing his country store clothes. Leper, Leper. The exposure drew us violently together. I was the closest person in the world to him now, and he to me. Leper, Leper. I was about to cry myself. Stop that. Now just stop. Don't do that. Stop doing that, Leper. When he became quieter, not less despairing, but too exhausted to keep on, I said, I'm sorry I brought up Brinker. I didn't know you hated him so much. Leper didn't look capable of such hates, especially now. Leper breaks down. With his rapid plumes of breath puffing out as from a toiling steam engine, his nose and eyes gone red, and his cheeks red too, in large irregular blotches. Leper had the kind of fragile, fair skin given to high, unhealthy coloring. He was all color, painted at random, but none of it highlighted his grief. Instead of desperate and hate-filled, he looked, with his checkered outfit and blotchy face, like a half-prepared clown. I don't really hate Brinker. I don't really hate him, not any more than anybody else. Like a half-prepared. I don't really hate him, not any more than anybody else. His swimming eyes cautiously explored me. The wind lifted a sail of snow and blew it past us. It was only he drew in his breath so sharply that it made a whistling sound. The idea of his face on a woman's body, that's what made me psycho. Ideas like that. I don't know, I guess they must be right. I guess I am psycho. I guess I must be. Did you ever have ideas like that? No. Would they bother you if you did? If you happened to keep imagining a man's head on a woman's body? Or if sometimes the arm of a chair turned into a human arm if you looked at it too long? Things like that. Would they bother you? I didn't say anything. Maybe everybody imagines things like that when they're away from home, really far away, for the first time. Do you think so? The camp I went to first, they called it a reception center, got us up every morning when it was pitch black, and there was food like the kind we throw out here, and all my clothes were gone, and I got this uniform that didn't even smell familiar. All day I wanted to sleep after we got to basic training. I kept falling asleep all day long at the lectures we went to, and on the firing range and everywhere else, but not at night. Next to me there was a man who had a cough that sounded like his stomach was going to come up. One of these times it sounded like it would come up through his mouth and land with a splatter on the floor. He always faced my way. We did sleep head to foot, but I knew it would land near me. I never slept at night. During the day I couldn't eat this food that should have been thrown away, so I was hungry except in the mess hall. So Leper starts telling his story. The mess hall. The army has the perfect word for everything. Did you ever think of that? I imperceptibly nodded and shook my head. Yes and no. And the perfect word for me, he added in a distorted voice as though his tongue had swollen. Psycho. I guess I am. I must be. Am I, though? Or is the army? Because they turned everything inside out. I couldn't sleep in bed, and I had to sleep everywhere else. I couldn't eat in the mess hall, and I had to eat everywhere else. Everything began to be inside out. And the man next to me at night, coughing himself inside out. That's when things began to change. One day I couldn't make out what was happening to the corporal's face. He kept changing into faces I knew from somewhere else, and then I began to think he looked like me, and then Leper's voice had thickened unrecognizably. He changed into a woman. I was looking at him as close as I'm looking at you, and his face turned into a woman's face, and I started to yell for everybody. I began to yell that everyone would see it so that everyone would see it too. I didn't want to be the only one to see a thing like that. So he was frightened by what he saw. I yelled louder and louder to make sure everyone within reach of my voice would hear. You can see there wasn't anything crazy in the way I was thinking, can you? I had a good reason for everything I did, didn't I? But I couldn't yell soon enough or loud enough, and when somebody did finally come up to me, it was this man with a cough who slept in the next cot. He was holding a broom because we had been sweeping out the barracks, but I saw right away that it wasn't a broom. It was a man's leg, which had been cut off. I remember thinking that he must have been at the hospital helping with an amputation when he heard my yell. You can see there's logic in that. The crust beneath us continued to crack as we reached the border of the field. The frigid trees were also cracking with the cold. The two sharp groups of noises sounded to my ears like rifles being fired in the distance. I said nothing, and Leper, having said so much, went on to say more, to speak about the wind and crackings as though his story would never be finished. Then they grabbed me, and there were arms and legs and heads everywhere, and I couldn't tell when, any minute. Shut up. Softer, more timidly, when any minute. Do you think I want to hear every gory detail? Shut up. I don't care. I don't care what happened to you, Leper. I don't give a damn. Do you understand that? This has nothing to do with me. Nothing at all. I don't care. I turned around and began a clumsy run across the field, in a line which avoided his house and aimed toward the road leading back into town. I left Leper telling his story to the wind. He might tell it forever. I didn't care. I didn't want to hear any more of that. I had already heard too much. What did he mean by telling me a story like that? I didn't want to hear any more of it, not now or ever. I didn't care because it had nothing to do with me, and I didn't want to hear any more of it, ever. Obviously, that's foreshadowing. So, Gene, over here, fearful of his own mind. And that concludes our reading of John Knowles' A Separate Piece. Thank you for watching, and join me on Friday as we read chapters 11 and 12, it seems, or possibly just 11, but maybe both. They're getting really long here at the end. Or 12 and 13. No, it's 11 and 12. Well, join me then. And until then, it was quite a nice time reading these last few, or this lead up to the climactic moment.